able to admit that as a youth he'd experienced forms of racism and oppression, but that it really didn't exist anymore. The FSLN had eliminated all of that. And he too, once again, brought up the notion that this was not something that I should do. I should not be doing this kind of research because it might put me at risk. And I said, at this point, having heard it twice, I asked, well, what risk might I be threatened with here? And he said, well, in some cases, the military officers are not well educated and not very sophisticated. And they might just arrest you under some grounds of suspicion. And since there were no police there, it was basically the Eastern Coast is policed by the Army and the Navy. The civil courts are few and far between. He was basically saying I could be arrested and put in jail and for no reason. So I thanked him, and fortunately this came towards the end of my stay in that part of the country and whatnot. But all the people that spoke about racism spoke about this hidden dimension that in public is spoken of this way, and many people feel fearful to speak out about it. So there was a backdrop there of political influence that I did not expect, perhaps, again, naively, but it was a very important part of my experience in Nicaragua. In Belize, there was not such a hostile environment. However, there was a post-colonial structure there in which the ruling class, people there, which are the Creole people, which are basically African Belizean people, who the British had made into their mid-level bureaucrats, they now run the country. And so the hierarchy that was established by the British has changed only with the elimination of the British and not with any of the other changes. So the Garifuna and the Maya people, and even the Mestizo people in Belize, who are a small but growing minority, since it is an English-speaking country primarily, are kept from resources by the governmental authorities there. So that's a little bit of that background, and there are lots of more stories I could tell you about how that's been played out. But there is this very large element of institutional racism and oppression, which informs individual opinion as well. It's this is perhaps too strong a term, but state-sponsored fits for me in terms of what I experienced and heard from the people who were speaking there. Now, the artists themselves and their lives and their experience. There was a breakdown along two different groups, and perhaps, in retrospect, this might have also been anticipated, but the visual artists and the dancers were the ones who felt most constrained in their ability to express themselves about these issues. The visual artists said again and again and again, yes, we know these things are true, yes, we feel these things, but expressing them might be very difficult for us. And we are concerned that if we do start making art that shows these things, the government will show us disfavor and perhaps block our access to the media or our ability to display our work in stores or in galleries. The dancers and the dance teachers that I interviewed experienced an extraordinary amount of racist and misogynist behavior from all over the country. The women especially were regarded almost as prostitutes. The Garifuna dancers. One woman quote exactly in my head, on her first performance in Managua, was talking about how all the people in the venue where Short Troop was to appear were making sexual comments to the women.
Oh, wow.
Before the performance. And they basically ignored them. And then she performed. And they all made comments to her skill and ability and strength and beauty as a dancer. And then they went back to making their sexual advances and grew angry when she refused them. And the use of slang words for a prostitute was almost interchangeable with dancers. That's one of the things that they frequently said. Now, I would have to say that meeting some of these people was not just informative for me. It was for a great honor to meet some of these people who displayed such courage in the face of experiences that would crush some of us, me perhaps. And even though they did not feel that they could express themselves directly about their experience, many of them developed a fire and a desire to persist and to manifest their art no matter what faced them. And that to me was astonishing. I'm quite convinced that's not the best way to raise and train artists and dancers. But to see their courage and to hear their stories was quite remarkable. The poets and the musicians, however, were extraordinarily verbal, and two of them were just mesmerizing in the kind of things that they had done. One of the poets it was the longest interview I think I had. It was over 3 hours long. Basically, he reenacted a performance he had done. And it was part his own spoken word. It was partly prose. It was partly self-disclosure. It was partly political critique. And his brilliance at being able to use both Spanish and English and Creole was so stunningly swift and beautiful. And because he was willing to expose the hypocrisy everywhere as he saw it, the audience, which might have been quite hostile to him, was very approving of his work. But he would be an unusual poet, an extraordinarily different poet that would be able to talk about the brutality of the government on one hand and have them laughing about themselves the next minute. And the government has used its own troops to literally stop people from voting. It has, in the last 5 years, killed numbers of people, especially on the eastern coast of the country, because they dared to protest about government policies. So this gentleman, recognizing what he was up against, was still fearless and spoke clearly, directly, and truly as to what he believed was right. Another musician, in his lyrics, he was able to identify the forces of the problem, both specifically and in generally, that the forces of racism and oppression corrupt all our culture and hurt all of us. And also, he was a voice of unity, calling for people to reconsider where they are and find ways to assess their commonalities and recognize that in a small country, everyone needs to work together. But he had also met with being blacklisted because of some of the things he had done. That did not stop him, but the government